Fantastic. And we are back to change tack a little bit from some sessions around sustainability and focus on some ethical sourcing and human rights. I am joined by the team at Coles, and I'm sure they're going to tell you this, but I believe Coles is responsible for feeding something like 50% of Australia, aren't they? But anyway, I will not take up any more time apart from to just do some very, very quick housekeeping before I hand over to Mabel and Grigor. As always, questions are very, very welcome, and Mabel and Grigor will be taking some at the end of this session. So if you do have questions, please feel free to leave them in the Q&A box in your chat functionality. And of course, also let us know what you think. General thoughts and comments are always welcome in the chat too. We're looking forward to a really fantastic session. So I'm going to hand over to Mabel Wong, who is the Ethical Sourcing Operations Manager at Coles, and also to Grigor Froane, who is an Ethical Sourcing Specialist. And on that note, Mabel, I'm going to hand over to you.
Thank you so much, Caitlin, and a huge thanks really for inviting Coles to participate in this and to really share our journey in terms of our human rights due diligence and ethical sourcing program with our supply chains. And obviously, I'll start off just by introducing who Coles is, etc., and then I'll pass on to Gregor, my colleague who's joining me for this session. Guess for those who don't know who Coles is, Caitlin, I guess, gave a bit of a brief about who we are. We are a leading Australian supermarket retailer. Just in our last FY financial year, we grossed over 39.4 billion in revenue. We provide customers with everyday products, including fresh food, groceries, household goods, liquor, and financial services through our store network, as well as online platforms, averaging about 18 million transactions every week across our store network, as well as e-commerce platforms. And really our retail brands are supported by our central support operations, including functions like buying, warehousing, delivery, meat processing, marketing. Also, we are a public listed company on the Australian Stock Exchange and are headquartered in Melbourne, Victoria. And really, I guess that just for those obviously who would be, visiting supermarkets, etc., just to sort of show on the slide the spread really of products and services that obviously the business runs, and then therefore, if you can imagine the diversity of the suppliers, etc., that the ethical sourcing program as well as our human rights due diligence would need to be covering. And the question, to be honest, the ethical sourcing team we constantly get is, well, how do you cover the breadth given the diversity, of services, different types of products, different sizes of suppliers? And that's probably where today Gregor and myself want to be spending more time to be explaining what does human rights due diligence in practice look like, specifically for a retail supermarket. What have been some of our learnings? What are some of our reflections? What are still our ongoing challenges? And recognizing, obviously, this is definitely a journey for improvement. Just to explain, probably similar, you would see across others ethical sourcing programs. These are the 5 core pillars of our ethical sourcing program. The policy, our ethical sourcing policy, really sets the standards, sets our expectations, and sets the messaging we have with our suppliers, as well as what we put out in our public disclosure. And just to state, I think when people hear policy, they assume it's just a document lying on the shelf. Just to state, for us, this is very, very much a live document. It's very much, I would say, for the ethical sourcing team, I would say that we probably constantly refer to different sections within it. It's included as part of our contract. It forms also the basis for us to have the conversation with suppliers. It's very much a living and breathing document. Obviously, as I showed the earlier slide with the breadth that we covered, that it's next to impossible for us to be covering everything, and that shouldn't be the way. Therefore, our ethical sourcing program is very much based on a risk-informed approach, where The program obviously has to segment and target the higher risk products or suppliers, etc. And really through this risk assessment, risk segmentation, then, we take on this program implementation into due diligence. And due diligence can take a whole suite of tools. Obviously, we've got a well-proud, very robust audit program. But there are also other tools that lets us do our due diligence. We've got grievance mechanisms that lets us understand what's happening on the ground, what's happening in our supply chain. And really, because of where we sit in the risk and compliance team, then really that running to ground what we find in terms of human rights risk, in terms of particular issues, we are absolutely focusing also on remediation and ongoing monitoring as part of our ongoing ethical sourcing program. So I explained, I guess I shared a bit earlier, this is probably where we want to be focusing our time in terms of today's presentation, when one sees the breadth of where one covers, and then, we would get the question about how do you do it? How do you cover across? How do you make sure that, due diligence is followed through, and that it's not just at the beginning of the sourcing stage that you follow through on an ongoing basis as part of business as usual? I guess to share a bit of a background, our program in the last 3 years have really taken a strong, I guess, foundation and growth. We were ethical sourcing as an area was called out in 2019 in a shareholder resolution in terms of not performing as well as we would like to, and really with that. That really gave the business the impetus as to what we need to be reshaping in terms of our ethical sourcing program. That's when also the ethical sourcing team moved from central operations into our legal risk and compliance group function, which then meant that really as an ethical sourcing team, we're touching across the business. And with that situation, it also means that ethical sourcing is called out as a material risk for the business. We are on the corporate risk register. That then also means strong board oversight in terms of ethical sourcing. We were previously, I guess, reporting on a monthly basis. Now we're on a quarterly reporting basis to our board as well as our audit risk committee. And that means that really the program has got obviously significant board as well as ELT buy-in support, and they are so closely intertwined in terms of what we do as an ethical sourcing team. The other areas that we always get asked, well, how do you embed it into business? I think Gregor and myself would cover it separately, very much embedded in terms of our operations as well as from that sourcing to contracting, and much more than that ongoing, business as usual process that we have is not good enough to just have this process once the supplier enters into the business, but it's very much an ongoing, as long as there is a relationship with Coles, then we make sure that that ongoing due diligence is also happening. I would say that Gregor and I are really fortunate to be in a team size of 12. I guess to some people they might think, oh, that's huge, or to some others, no, that's small. But really the team size that we have is also made up with human rights specialists. We also have 2 certified social compliance auditors part of the team, which then means that we could be turning, I guess, to this internal expertise to ensure, as we're reading the audit reports, is it what should we be better understanding in terms of our supply chain, etc. And with that type of internal resourcing, that lets us do what we do. So I guess what I'm going to do now is pass on to Gregor. Gregor's our ethical sourcing specialist and has had experience really cutting across the different business functions, from fresh produce to liquor, grocery, etc. And I think it will be nice to sort of switch the tone a little bit to sort of explain in depth as to what actually happens across the different business units. On to you, Gregor.
Thank you so much, Mabel. So before we go into what enables us to do what we do, I really just want to take some time and go over our ethical program scope. Mabel introduced sort of our supply chain briefly, and I just want to elaborate on some of the specifics, because depending on who we are talking to, we have to tailor our engagement to get the most out of any given communication. So our program extends to our various businesses. So we've got our supermarkets business, our Coles Express business, and our liquor business. Each of these are different, but are a core of everything that we do. So if we just take some time to go over the supermarkets business, we have various business units that sit within our supermarkets operation. Those will be grocery or deli or meat, among others, as well as fresh produce, which you can see on the screen. Our supply chain there goes from raw materials right through to the packing operation. And while on the screen we do go, or it shows that we go to tier 2, this in fact can sometimes go as far as tier 3 or even further down the supply chain, depending on how the operations are set up. So for example, if you have in fresh produce a grower that is also a packer, you are automatically also dealing with a tier 3 operation. Now, for our supermarkets, specifically thinking about grocery and excluding fresh produce for just a second, we are usually dealing with large manufacturers, large processing plants. And it is important to keep in mind that with these, sometimes we have less leverage and less influence. So it is important for us to really understand where they are in terms of their ethical sourcing journey and how much engagement they have previously had. And I will go on to how we do that in detail. Also to keep in mind is some of these larger operations, especially when we're dealing with grocery suppliers, are overseas. That means there can be cultural differences or there could be language barriers. Luckily, we have a very competent partner in Elevate who facilitates some of that engagement for us, specifically in the Asian market. Of course, we can also use our agents, which we often do, our direct suppliers, which can facilitate that engagement for us, and sometimes even have people who are much closer to the site. Our Coles Express business operates our convenience stores, which offer basic necessities for our shoppers, keeping in mind that we are currently moving away from that business. And then we have the fresh produce business. Now, this business works a bit different. It's part of our supermarkets, but the chain can be, or the supply chain can be somewhat unique. The impacts, the environmental impacts, the macro impacts or influences are also quite different. Here we have to keep in mind things such as seasonality, weather events, climate change, amongst others, such as a shortage of workers, inflation, which all have a very significant impact on the growers and the suppliers that sit in that category. What that means for us in ethical sourcing is that we have to take these things into consideration when we speak with our suppliers and our sites and have that engagement up front. Another unique aspect of fresh produce, but that's also applicable to our liquor business, is that there are small suppliers, very small sites that cater to regional demand. This means, and especially for these small suppliers, if you think of comparing them to those large overseas factories, they might not have those resources. They might not have a dedicated QA manager or a person that is responsible for corporate social responsibility, let alone ethical sourcing. So what that really means for us is we have to take them on the journey right from the start, engage them as early as possible, and make them understand why we do what we do and why it's important. Now, moving on to liquor, there are many crossovers between liquor and fresh produce, especially when we're talking about raw materials. But important for these sites is to note that they are passionate, they have a long history usually, and they have certain provenance. But you need to keep that in mind when having conversations with them, because it helps to shape and it helps to make it about them. And that's really the point I'm trying to drive home, is when we have any engagement, we make it about their journey and how they can meet our requirements. Of course, we also, as in fresh produce, we have seasonal suppliers. So it's important to capture and start that conversation during seasonal peaks. Across all of these different businesses, It is vital that we understand, we engage early with the commercial teams to understand the commercial commitments that have been made to their suppliers, because that can also impact the conversations that we have with them when we engage them on their ethical sourcing journey or human rights issues. Lastly, we've got our procurement non-trade side of the business, services and goods, which I will pass back to Mabel now to walk through.
Thanks a lot, Gregor. Actually, there's a really interesting question that's come up. We're both nodding because it applies for both, I guess, the goods for resale as well as goods not for resale section of what we do. But we will probably come to that a bit later to tackle the question. But please keep them coming in. That keeps kind of like this interaction active and live. I think for most businesses, who have a human rights ethical sourcing program, as it should, most would commence obviously with, what they sell. That makes a lot of sense. And for Cole's ethical sourcing program, that's very much where we had our foundations as per the section that Gregor was sharing earlier. Recognizing as well that obviously in terms of supply chain human rights risks, that they don't only lie in the items we sell. It's also very much, in terms of the services and goods that we use to keep our supermarkets operating, right? Like our logistics, trolley collection, security, the list goes on. And so really in the last year and a half, recognizing that we also need to be implementing really the ethical sourcing program in a rigorous manner for our procurement non-trade section. And this particular slide just focuses some of the higher risk areas, either because they've got a specific Coles brand, like our uniform, where we know we need to be paying a lot more attention to, as well as high risk services that are typically characterized by perhaps a workforce that maybe less skilled, or perhaps on a particular wage component. And so that particular ethical sourcing program is also implemented in terms of our procurement non-trade products and services component. One of the areas, again, that we're repeatedly asked, well, how does one embed that? What does that look like from, sourcing right up to contract? Obviously, ethical sourcing is just one risk domain. We are very much embedded into what we call our third-party risk management process. That means that any procurement non-trade over a particular value, they would need to go through our third-party risk management process, of which then ethical sourcing is one risk domain that gets incorporated and looked at as procurement looks across, a contract and the different types of risks, health and safety, privacy, data, security, ethical sourcing, and we're embedded as part of that third-party risk management process. And until these different risks are addressed, and that means for our team, engaging with procurement, engaging with the supplier, sometimes engaging obviously also with suppliers, subcontractors, to ensure that they understand what our requirements are and they understand what they need to do in the course of the contract. And until we have that kind of agreement, and obviously that they're signing up to ethical sourcing policy, until they go through those steps, they would not be approved to be, onboarded as a supplier. So that's also sort of embedding the ethical sourcing process for the procurement non-trade. I could probably give a whole range, I guess, of examples here, but perhaps the one that I will highlight as an example is on last mile. Obviously, I guess with COVID, as per any other retailer, significant demand for last mile providers. We talked about this in our last modern slavery statement that was published as well. I think we knew as a team for last mile providers where potentially they would not be having the same job security nor benefits as per an employee. but recognizing obviously our significant demand and use for these types of providers, and if they are not captured by those traditional sort of employee relationships, then how much could we be asking in terms of understanding their wages, their earnings, et cetera. And it was really through probably quite a lot of extensive discussion with our last mile providers, where we were then able to better understand trip level earnings. Something I think Coles and our team were told that they were probably not asked by other customers, nor did they provide such type of data. And I think for us, it was a sort of it was something that we learned really a lot about in terms of last mile delivery, the complexities of any trip earnings that could be I guess complicated with wait time and cancellation charges and algorithms. And I think a lot of that learning then sort of gave us an understanding of, okay, for last mile providers, I think this is what we're talking about when we're looking at human rights due diligence, just to give an example of some of the trickier ones that we've had to sort of walk through with our suppliers and with the business in terms of understanding some of these risks. I think sort of like covering both sides now. This is probably the part of the presentation where I'm going to hand over to Gregor, where we're wanting to sort of spend more time. Some of your questions here, in fact, will be answered through Gregor's presentation, but we're happy to sort of facilitate some of that Q&A in a bit. So Gregor, on to you.
Okay, thank you so much, Mabel. I now want to take some time to really talk through what enables due diligence at an operational level. So to first understand how we do that, it's important to know how we're resourced, how we support the rest of the business, and how we make our decisions. At the core, we have very talented and experienced team members. As Mabel said, we have a relatively large team that is uniquely resourced, and luckily we also have 2 certified auditors with us who really help us when we do have any questions. Of course, we invest a lot in training as well. We know we are in an ever-changing environment, a rapidly changing environment at that, so it's important to develop some of those skills. We have expert guest speakers, we have industry leaders who join as well. And through that, we exchange best practice, and then we can learn and develop. Similarly, as we invest in our team members, we also invest in our program and develop a program. We know that, again, we are in a changing environment and we have macro influences, changes to legislation. We need to make sure that we keep on top of that. And then also manage our stakeholders and shareholders' expectations, as well as our customers' expectations, in line with the commitments that we've made. Of course, we also need to make sure that we're transparent and our results and what we declare are measurable and effective. So we have an outward-facing modern slavery statement, but we also regularly review the numbers that sit behind that and make sure that we are as transparent as possible in our declaration. Now, all of that wouldn't be possible without a coherent, effective, and adaptable data system. And we are very lucky to have been in a position where we have a very capable partner who allows us to enact changes that we require at a very rapid pace, but also visualize data in an actionable manner. And that really helps us because, as you can imagine, and as you've seen hopefully from the previous slides, we are a large business. We have a lot of suppliers and sites. That means we also deal with a lot of data. Visualizing that and distilling it to take out really the key elements can be very difficult. That visualization that we have also enables us to share it with our other internal stakeholders. So what we do is we share the access to our data platform and that visualization with some of the commercial teams, with our category teams, the business units. And what that allows them to do is go into the system before they have a meeting with a supplier, understand very clearly what the situation is, see where a supplier is and has been, and then weave that into the conversation that they have. For us, it makes it easy to have those data-based conversations as well. So when we speak with a supplier or with a site, we can look at their journey, we can look at the trajectory they have been on, and we can also identify significant issues that a supplier or a site may have and work through it with them, with always keeping in mind we have a focus on continuous improvement. Now, on that note, there are things to keep in mind, which I would just like to mention. Our requirements are applicable across all suppliers, be they small suppliers or larger suppliers. But what we can change is our approach and our way in which we communicate with those suppliers. So, for example, with a small supplier, a small regional farmer, for instance, I would pick up the phone. I would walk them through what it means to ethically source, walk them through what modern slavery means, have a conversation with them and develop that understanding. Whereas with a larger supplier, they may have a dedicated resource, a simple email may be enough to get that conversation kicked off. Of course, what we can also do is engage internal teams early and gather some contextual background. So just as they may have a look at how a supplier is doing in terms of their ethical sourcing, we can go to our internal teams and understand where they are at in terms of the commercial commitments that have been offered to them, in terms of the environmental factors. You know, have there been floods? Has there been hail when we're talking about fresh produce? Has that supplier been severely affected? That enables us to ask the right questions, but also take the right actions and make sure the supplier can still meet our requirements. Knowing and having a good grasp of those factors can then help us leverage some of these industry trends. So we can focus on collaborative suppliers. We can look for advocates within our supplier base who can act as a beacon and help spread the word, but also engage other sites and suppliers so that when we do start the conversation with them, we are already a step ahead. Lastly, and this is what I think what we do really well at Coles, is we make it about them. So we look at their unique circumstances. Each supplier and each production site is different. We engage them early, and understanding their journey, understanding their history can then lead to them meeting our requirements. Of course, then we have some reflections that we can go over, which are really important. And the first one I want to point out, for us, it's essential to go beyond self-declaration. Too often do we have suppliers that reach out and ask, are you compliant with modern slavery legislation? Tick. Do you have a modern slavery statement? Tick. It's more of a ticking exercise where no one asks the question, okay, what does it mean? What does it mean that you have a modern slavery statement? What does it mean that you're compliant? What are you actually doing? What are the activities that sit behind your due diligence? So what it means for us is looking beyond just a ticking exercise and evidencing claims. Let's say a supplier comes to us and says they have a policy. Okay, great. Show me the implementation of that policy. You're paying your workers the correct amount? Great. Show me a payslip. That really helps us to go that extra, take that extra step and go to the next level. Of course, that means we have to actively look for evidence, and we do that through our auditing. So at the end of the day, for us, it means saying your supply chain is complex is not enough, because at the end of the day, every supply chain is complex, or most are. It's important to define the complexity, look beyond complexity, and understand what each supply chain is and what the different partners have to contribute. Now, when it comes to evidence, sometimes certain documents or some evidence that is supplied to us doesn't pass the sniff test. What we mean by that is there's just something off about the evidence, or we think there's something more to it. In that case, we don't accept the evidence as face value, and we ask further questions. We try to go a bit deeper and see if there's more to it. So, for example, with payslips, we might ask for more information, might ask for wider sample period. Same with timesheets or working hours. And for policies, we might look for more evidence of implementation. important for us is going beyond that legal compliance piece and actually ethically source. So that means walking suppliers and sites through what it means, which I've mentioned before, but then also explain to them what the ETI base code is, the Ethical Trading Initiative, and really have that conversation with them from the get-go that we are going well beyond legal compliance for the right reasons. That all is supported with the process being embedded in our commercial processes. So the way that's done at Coles is we have a gated process with very clear accountability. So all stakeholders that need to be involved in the sign-off process know exactly where a site is at every given stage. So when it comes to ethical sourcing and when we come to that key gate, they know exactly where a site is or needs to be, so that when the time comes and they ask the question, okay, is this supplier good to go? We can say no, or they actually need to do some, they're fine, or they need to do something else. And more often than not now, do I have internal stakeholders reach out to us and say, where's the supplier at? Or how can we support to get them to where they need to be? Of course, this also supports key collaboration between internal teams, because it's important for other teams, especially the business units and the commercial teams, to be across where a site is in terms of the ethical sourcing journey. And it helps keep ethical sourcing front in mind. Luckily, and I think this has been really key, and Mabel mentioned this before, ethical sourcing at Coles is supported right from the top. Mm-hmm. We've got a very engaged board that is very keen to understand where the challenges lie, where the risks lie in ethical sourcing, but we also have an engaged leadership team which are there to support, but then also challenge us on requirements and specific suppliers, sometimes down to one non-conformance. I think what that also facilitates is that we have a very educated internal stakeholder group, right down to the different business units, and that then helps paint the entire picture of when a supplier comes to us, we're speaking with one voice. We're not fragmented. Everyone has the same information. It also enables us to make fast-paced decision-making, which is very important when we do come to a decision where a supplier does not meet our requirements, when they are not willing to comply, or when there is a non-conformance that is just too severe for us to continue to do business with that supplier. We can say no. We have that. We are empowered, but we can also have those conversations with the commercial team, with our internal stakeholders who are educated in the space. Lastly, and I think this is what I've been trying to drive home today, and I hope I don't sound too much like a broken record, but it's taking the suppliers on the journey, and it's having that tailored engagement, which has enabled us to do what we do. So, making sure that each situation, knowing that each situation is different, and taking the time to speak to individual sites. I know it can take a lot of time, especially when you have a lot of different production sites, let alone suppliers, and sometimes especially with less educated suppliers or less educated on this topic, it may take, you might have a 30-minute phone call, you might have a 45-minute phone call, but it's important because taking them on the journey means they can become advocates. It means that you have a strong footing for the journey ahead, not only for ethical sourcing, but their entire engagement with the business. It also means that we work with our auditors and with our certification bodies. So luckily, we have the benefit that we closely collaborate with the certification bodies. Mm-hmm. They give us the information from the front line when they are on site, when they are auditing, and we give them the information of the feedback from the sites of how some of these audits have gone, and that fosters that continuous improvement approach as well between us. What we also do, and I actually do this quite often, is we ask for support from our frontline teams and our internal stakeholders. Sometimes there are difficult conversations. Sometimes the frontline teams just have more information because they deal with the suppliers and the sites on a daily basis. So it makes much more sense to have them sit in on a meeting or facilitate the engagement. I think the last piece in terms of tailored engagement, and that's sometimes you just have to do it, is you have to strap on your work boots and you have to put on your high visibility vest and you have to go on site. You have to speak to the owners, the production owners. You have to speak to the workers, and you have to understand what the sentiment is on site. And those engagements, I think, for us, have been the most rewarding by far, because you get a good understanding of what the situation is in any given business unit, in any given industry, and then also helps to validate some of the claims and some of the information that you're receiving. Lastly, probably my last point here is that suppliers and sites are always at various stages of their ethical sourcing journey. So it's important to understand, how resourced they are, what level of engagement has previously occurred with a site or supplier, and then make it about them. So I think I'll leave it there. I don't know how we're doing with time.
No, we're good with that Q&A section, and there's actually quite a few really good questions. We'll keep your mic on. Yeah. So happy to obviously take it offline if we don't have enough time. So I think, Gregor, you can see the questions too. We'll try to tackle, I guess, as many as we can. I think one of it saying, how long has it taken for you to embed the program? I think as per what Gregor was sharing earlier, obviously when people think embedding, first thing they think about is processes, systems, etc., of which both Gregor and I shared how it's done, in what type of risk management process. So that's clearly important. But actually the other pieces that Gregor's sharing around, it being understood by the different suppliers, having the buy-in, having ongoing engagement, ongoing conversation, different types of conversations, how you do it depending on the supplier. So to answer that question on how long, I say it's an ongoing journey to embed,
really
obviously the process and the team, to resource it, the board to support us to ask the right questions, to ask the difficult questions, but it can't just stop there. It's ongoing education, capacity building. Sometimes processes need to change as well. For a retailer, obviously, we've gone a lot more online now. It means that certain things we need to be stepping back to say, well, actually, hang on, for human rights due diligence, if we were talking about, last mile providers, as I shared earlier, then is it the same? Should we be looking at it the same way as we do for human rights due diligence in regular logistics? And we realized we couldn't. So it's evolving, it's ongoing, it's a combination of processes and people and education. I will take on this question, Gregor, and I'll pass it to you around how do we, I guess, for those suppliers who have to respond to different customers, then how do you get across, I guess, that, so that there isn't a fatigue, for different customers. So the question asks, how do you cut through all the requirements suppliers are receiving from customers, let's just say from Coles versus others, so that they prioritize a program like this? I mentioned earlier on how our ethical sourcing policy really is the beginning foundation, sets the standards. If you looked across different customers' policies and codes of conduct, chances are they're actually quite similar. And so I think it's perhaps the difference with Coles is that we are expecting evidence of compliance. So it's not just a sign off, and therefore I don't believe we're asking for different things from customers. Obviously, there are some tools that we know are used by different suppliers. As an example, Gregor shared earlier that we obviously have a close partnership with the SEDEX program, with the SMETA audit program as one of our due diligence tools, recognizing that various of our other suppliers use the same. and therefore if different customers are asking, for example, for a ZX Matter audit, then we would be asking the same, and therefore they should not be, having to do different audits for different customers. So as well, I think it's also a component of us seeing what is a robust tool. And then also if other customers are asking the same of our suppliers, and if that meets our expectations, then that should, reduce really that, I guess, hopefully that kind of load to our suppliers. I didn't know if Gregor wanted to add a bit more on that.
Yeah, I think I agree with that. And I think it's also, when we're talking about remediation, where of course we're one of the only ones that go to that extra depth. But we do I think Mabel is right in that the requirements are very similar across the board. So it makes it easier to have those conversations and get people on board in the process.
Yeah, Gregor, I really want to take this particular question. How does the program complement your sustainability and environmental initiative? I wanted to pick that up because
Thought you might.
One of the areas I covered under procurement non-trade, there was probably an icon there on renewable energy on solar. It's not a new topic. I think those in this sector would understand or hear the concept, just transition, that you're not trading off a human right for environmental right and vice versa. For us, really, as a business, certainly for the ethical sourcing team, we meet on a weekly basis with our energy team, really to be, discussing and understanding if we were talking about, for example, recognizing that there could be human rights issues with regards to polysilicon raw material for solar panels, but also recognizing the business have got significant, as we should, renewable energy, and emissions commitments. How do we marry the two? I think this has been one really, the business has taken it seriously, and therefore really with the energy team, we have a weekly meeting to sort of first and foremost sort of explain the challenges and the importance of both sides. How do we try to find suppliers who could do both? And that's the increasing, I would say, expectations of suppliers, that it's not obviously only good enough to be meeting one set of requirements, that you need to also take into account if there are human rights concerns that one needs to be taking into account. And then I think it's a matter of, if the will is there, then the commitment is there to try to speak to our suppliers, find the one who could be doing both, but getting both teams, energy team, ethical sourcing team, procurement involved, to be aware of both sides of the story, and how do we find, suppliers who could be doing both. So it's a very pertinent question. I think it's effort, due diligence, ongoing education as well.
There is one question I would like to answer as well, and that how do you get suppliers on board if you are not their most important customer? Do you ever have challenges with them investing in the process? What I'll do is I'll answer the second part of that question with yes. But I think it's much more complicated than that. If it depends on the challenges, it depends on what we mean by the most important customer. So depending on the commercial commitments, depending on the situation, the history of the site, or the interactions they have had with us as their customer, of course, sometimes there can be challenges. We have to keep in mind that their ethical sourcing is not their only contact point, as is with any business. So being coherent is really key. And if we do face challenges, making sure that everyone is across it in the business and understands the path forward, but then with the customer, with the supplier, having that conversation. And as Mabel said, the requirements are similar across multiple vendors. So if they fulfill our requirements, there is a certain likelihood that they will meet the requirements of other vendors, which helps engage them and facilitate that understanding that, okay, what I'm doing is actually being compliant with multiple of my customers. So that really helps. But yeah, at the end of the day, you know, and regardless of what the relationship is, it's taking each situation or knowing the context behind each engagement that we have, and being sure that we can always rely on our internal teams to get support and work through it.
Yeah. I'll probably take this one as a last question, given the time. One of my favorite topics around subcontractors and subcontracting. So the question is, how do you understand the human rights aspects pertaining to your, I guess, suppliers, subcontractors, any systems that you use? Obviously, for our program, it does go down to tier 2, but I'll give the example for services, probably one less looked at perhaps by different companies. We knew quite quickly on with services suppliers, let's just give the example of security, trolley collection, logistics, right? That several of these suppliers would be using subcontractors, and that's probably those on the call would know that's where risks are higher. Why one is a further tier away, there's less visibility, less transparency. For us, I'll pick on that point that Gregor shared earlier, that beyond declaration to getting evidence, for subcontractors of our high-risk services, we do have a wage compliance review where basically we are looking at our subcontractors, whether or not their workers are being paid correctly, receiving their entitlements. How do we do this? Obviously we've got auditors in our team, but also it's the journey of working directly with our immediate suppliers to also build their capacity to be understanding and, you know, to be able to sort of report back to us, you know, where wage compliance is with regards to their suppliers. And then also, obviously, there are also third parties, you know, that one could be utilizing to better understand. I think that the piece around subcontractors is where the risks lie, and it's certainly an area that we are definitely investing, I would say, the right resource to be conducting the due diligence. And then if we find something there, it's working really with the suppliers to say, okay, we found something, and therefore, you know, now the piece to be obviously remediating and ensuring that it doesn't happen again. I realize we are at time, but thank you so much really for having Cole share. Realize that there's quite a few more sessions. Thank you so much, Caitlin. For questions that we didn't have time to respond, happy to take that offline. I'll pass it back to you, Caitlin.
Fantastic. Mabel, Gregor, thank you so much. I think this has been really informative, and based on what I'm seeing on the chat and the Q&A, people are absolutely fascinated by the program that you're running. Is there anything on your website that the audience can go and find? What is that URL?
It's well, if you look for Coles and Human Rights,
okay.
That particular page describes our ethical sourcing program and the different policies and non-slavery statement, etc. So just Google Coles Human Rights and it'll get you there.
Amazing. Thank you so much. We will definitely push people that way. And of course, we're going to be back very soon. But before we do that, I would love to ask all of you to complete this quick poll on how you found this session. Please let us know how well the session met your expectations. This is going to help us to ensure that when WSPD rolls around again, which will be a lot sooner than we all think it will, we will be able to deliver content to you that really is informative and instructive. So again, Gregor, Mabel, thank you so much for this session. We really appreciate it. And we're going to be back in just under 10 minutes time with a session on industry collaboration in Asia. Of course, this was a huge topic during the CPO panel discussion a little bit earlier today. So I'm looking forward to picking it up again with Robert Yang and Arti Kapoor. So we will see you all again very soon.